when did he start writing poetry, and what was his early works?
Yes, okay. So by the time he arrived on the Brunswick campus, Brunswick, Maine, as a 15-year-old, he spent his freshman year at home. That he was allowed to be tutored to the city of Portland, but then he began his sophomore year. By the time he arrived on the campus of Bowden College, he was already a published poet. His father, I mean, he loved his father. He respected his father. He listened to his father. His mother also, Zilpha Wadsworth Longfellow, was a great influence on his life, as women were basically throughout his life. And he heeded them and he listened to them, but he also had a mind of his own. He was going to be a poet. And while he was a student, even before he became a student at Bowden, he was submitting poems. And we look at some of them today. It's juvenilia. You wouldn't collect it. The Battle at Lovell's Pond is his first published poem in a Portland newspaper at the age of 13. But it's a poem, and it's drawn from his grandfather, General Peleg Wadsworth, was a hero of the Revolutionary War, a great hero of his, who influenced him greatly. So it was kind of based on stories that he'd heard from his grandfather. And while he was a student at Bowden, he submitted poetry to a number of publications, and they were published, several of them anonymously or just with his initials. And he was recognized as a person who was developing into someone who would be a person of significance, a literary force. But again, he couldn't afford to be a full-time poet. He really devoted the first 7 years after he got back to his scholarship, to teaching. He was also the librarian. He built at Bowden, so his collateral duty there was to help build the library. And he's credited for bringing in all of these European traditions. And he did a similar thing when he got to Harvard. He was selected to replace George Tickner at Harvard, and he functioned in the same capacity at Harvard for 18 years. So for 25 years, he was a professor of languages and a translator, and he wrote wonderful works of criticism. His first two published books were prose works, Outre from Air, the book I mentioned. The second one was Hyperion, which we'll discuss perhaps at some point. It was a book that included a roman éclat about his failed attempt to win the hand of Fanny Appleton, a 7-year quest, which I write about in the book. But then he turned in 1839 his first collection of poetry, 1839, Voices of the Night. And it was a wonderful collection. It had a number of poems in there, including a Psalm of Life, which I guess we can say was his breakthrough poem. It was published pseudonymously, but then it very quickly became known who wrote it. And it became an international sensation. It went through multiple printings and translated into at least 30 languages. People continue, they had footsteps on the sands of time, learn to labor and to wait. I mean, phrases that have become idiomatic in the language. People quote Longfellow today. They don't even realize they're quoting him. But that particular poem has at least 4 lines that have entered the language. That was his first breakthrough poem. That was 1839, while he was still teaching, even in 4 years before his second marriage to Fanny Appleton. And that same year, he published Hyperion. So that's a prose work, 1839, his first collection of poetry, 1839. And he also did some criticism that year. And he worked on a play in verse, which never went very far. But he was a man of letters. He was working and he worked. He had a really profound work ethic, which actually characterizes his entire life, literally until the final days of his life. He wrote a wonderful poem, in the final week of his life, The Bells of Saint Blas, which is, I think, one of his great poems. And he finished it a week before he died.